irrelevant. Now, we're still going to stay in this lane when we start talking about open source models. So I'm not like saying we're going to shift into some like new realm of relevance, but like there's also this like whole orthogonal set of concerns around like maybe you can't use an API for various reasons. Or maybe it's like you really do live in a regulated industry where you actually can't have this world where a model that's really crucial to how the experience that your end user has or how data is generated in your products, you can't have that changing behind the scenes without you controlling it or even knowing how it's being changed. You might have legal concerns about like what's going into training data sets of these commercial APIs. That's like certainly a hot topic of regulation right now. And then there's also this like kind of interesting, like the bottom row here, potentially more cost efficient. It's kind of subject to debate, and it's also like very dependent on your own engineering skill and kind of the workflows that you have access to, the hardware you have access to, things like this. But there's a lot of interesting studies going on, a lot of people actually demonstrating you can serve these models yourself potentially, and it'd be much cheaper in the long run. Now we'll see like how the business dynamics go, but there's a ton of different motivations that are kind of percolating for why people might want to use a less good model than GPT-4, even though it's like pretty clearly in most people's view, like that's the most skillful model at this point in time. But there's a lot of reasons. So that's kind of like my brain dump and how I parse this slide. But I'm curious, Hugo, do you have any other thoughts or any things that you'd add around like why open source anyways? Like why not just, are we all going to use ChatGPT forever?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of different, I think the security concerns are super important. I do think thinking about the governance boundary and where you want fine tuning to happen and what you want to have access to and what you want an external vendor to have access to will be super important. I think latency and cost, right? If you're sorry. Oh, sorry. It's springtime here in Sydney, so the pollen's getting to me. Those plane trees. But what I want to say, yeah, latency and the ability to retrieve really quick results may be super important for your application. So that will be a concern. On top of it, you mentioned earlier, Eddie, that vendor APIs maybe are cheaper than fine-tuning your own. I think although that is true, if you spend enough time querying vendor APIs, the costs add up, whereas perhaps if you fine-tune once, that's a one-off cost and maybe pretty expensive, but then you have your model there. But also, if you want to think, I mean, I don't want to go too deep into this, but if you want to be fine-tuning or training or doing RAG, retrieval augmented generation on your own corpus, perhaps you're even, uploading PDFs or docs to your model. And maybe you don't want to be doing that with a vendor API as well. Maybe you want to keep that all internal. So there are a lot of different concerns here. I mean, depending on what happens with the regulatory space, which the past couple of days we've seen some pretty wild action in, I see the open source space getting more and more exciting, to be honest.
Yeah. I definitely believe that that's a good direction for society to have on offer, and I hope that we keep making a ton of progress. And then, I mean, just looking at the last year, it's undeniable that there's a ton of extremely skilled, talented engineers and scientists working on open source LLMs. So seems like a reasonable bet to like do both in parallel, maybe, even if right now you think the commercial APIs are the way to go.
Yeah, so some incredible scientists, some incredible engineers, and then, in all honesty, with the backing of some pretty like heavy-hitting organizations. You think about like Meta is pretty bullish for whatever reasons it has on open source foundation models, and that that's nothing to
even, right? It's not even just corporations. It's like the Falcon models that have been making so much waves are directly funded by Saudi Arabia government.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's really amazing the level of investment, to your point, going into all of this.
Yeah. All right, let's jump in, man.
Yeah. Okay. So now there's like obviously a little bit of reasons why maybe not open source. We can go into that another time. And we did talk about like, there's this OpEx, CapEx trade-off that we're kind of making here. Unclear if that's even a trade-off. Maybe it's just strictly worse. Who knows? A study for another time. We want to get into the code again.
And the considerations may be different for different organizations as well, right? So
very true. Very true. Okay, cool. So what we're going to do now is basically come back to this generation API that we just saw with ChatGPT. We saw Cohere, we saw AI21. They all have a similar kind of chat completion API. What does that look like in Hugging Face, this open source distribution channel that we've been talking about? So first things first, we need to learn how to load a model from Hugging Face. So to do this, we'll pick the T5 model. T5 is this like kind of generic fine-tuning model that came out of Google in 2022. Really, really good for a lot of different tasks, much smaller than the GPT models as well. So it can be really good for tasks like paraphrasing, things like this, that maybe you don't need a full-on chatbot. What we're showing here is that the way that you load Hugging Face models is dead simple. It's like easier than scikit-learn even, which is wild, like from a data science point of view, that the complexity of what's happening under the hood here has been abstracted away to dot from pre-trained and then just pass a name. And that's coming from somewhere in the ether, basically, which we'll show you specifically what the ether is in a second and how to go shopping there. But what I want to show you here is that once we've loaded the model, this isn't an API anymore. We're not like sending the data across the network to OpenAI's servers. The model itself is on the server that's powering my sandbox. And we can see this when I just print the model state here. Like this is the actual structure of the PyTorch model that's underneath the Hugging Face trainer object. So we see things like all these layers of like self-attention and T5 attention and these specific linear layers inside of the neural network. Like you might, for people who know about QLoRa, that thing I mentioned earlier, like you might notice the Q and the V matrices are important. The thrust of this is that we actually have the model. It's on the device. It's something that we totally own. We like have the state of the model on our side, and we can do predictions like ChatGPT with this. Now, like taking a bit of a step back from that and like thinking about what is Hugging Face again. So there's like this super high level APIs is one piece of it to a bunch of different powerful models. And one of the main APIs that I think it's useful to reason about, whether you're a programmer, whether you're a business person, a product designer, an app designer, however you consider yourself, if you want to get into the Gen AI game, I think one really interesting thing to understand is this tasks page on Hugging Face. Like, look at all this stuff. Like, Hugo, do you have any suggestions about which one to click on, or like any thoughts that pop into your mind when you see all these options?
Firstly, it's wild and overwhelming, but also what a fantastic playground. So I'd encourage people to click on things that interest them. I mean, yeah, I mean, image to image, like that seems incredible, right?
Right. And then like there's more than 200 models that you can pull into your notebook in the same way that I just grabbed that T5 model with one line of code is what this means when you go to this model hub, and now you just see this one from Stable Diffusion that's image to image has been downloaded 8 million times.
Wild.
So there's like tons and tons of resources like this is the point here. Now there's like many tasks like we talked about, like you can do text classification with 3 S's and classification.
That's the real classification.
Yeah, exactly. Or you can do text generation. And this is what's going to be looking much similar to what we saw above with these chat completion APIs from the commercial vendors. So let's go ahead and get a model name. We're going to pick Bloom 560. So that means 560 million parameters. Relatively tiny in this generative AI LLM craze world. Like 2 years ago, 560 million is a huge model. But now like the biggest version of Bloom that Hugging Face trained in their big science projects is 180 billion. So almost 500 times bigger or something like this. Now, what we have done here is we're instantiating this thing called the pipeline. And all you need to pass to the pipeline at instantiation is the model name. So we're picking the Bloom and then a task. So here we're using text generation, but this task could be any of those tasks on the page that Hugo and I were just chatting about. Okay, now our new prompt is we're gonna just type something, and then the way that Bloom is working is it's just gonna do a continuation. So it's like a bit more of a raw version of what ChatGPT is doing under the hood, but it's a good representation too of the actual math problem, which is this autoregressive next token prediction that probably many people listening to this are familiar with. So our prompt is the Generative AI World Summit is dot dot dot, and we'll see what Bloom says / hallucinates. Remember, this is a much smaller model, like at least 1,000 times smaller parameter wise than GPT-4. And it's also like there's many engineering systems that are working around OpenAI's GPT-4 to keep in mind that really do set the response of that apart, that API and the ChatGPT interface apart from what we're doing here. But let's just make this a little bit bigger so people can read. But now we have a response. So that was relatively fast, like what, maybe 5-10 seconds. I wasn't really paying attention, but not terribly long. And we have a continuation that's kind of like how ChatGPT makes a continuation. It's a global conference that brings together the best in AI, ML, artificial intelligence. So we like already kind of see like, sure, the language generation is good, and this is like proper English, but it doesn't have the kind of like emergent intelligence that we see baked into a lot of the answers of ChatGPT, where it's like making a list and it doesn't even realize that AI is artificial intelligence in the items in this list, stuff like this. But it's like a pretty like powerful thing to be able to so quickly load a system like this or a model like this into a notebook and just get going and start building the real engineering systems around it to make something like a ChatGPT. There's some more stuff in this notebook that people can play around with, but it's not terribly different than what we've gone through so far. And I think we should keep moving, Hugo. How does that sound?
That sounds great. And I personally, like, I use Hugging Face all the time, but I appreciate your like whirlwind introduction to it and showing how we can get started with it immediately in a notebook as well. So, and if anyone, plays around with it and finds cool things, ping us in as comments to this video, or on our Slack as well, which I'll include a link to. We have a community Slack with thousands of data scientists and machine learning engineers and infrastructure engineers talking about this type of stuff. So I'll include a link in the video description there as well.
Cool. Yeah, feel free to interject if you have any like Hugging Face tangents you want to go on or anything. We can definitely keep it flexible here. Okay, let's just pop back into the slides briefly. All right, the next notebook we're going to dive into is about prompt engineering. So this is a very overloaded term, means a lot of things to a lot of people over the last couple of years, not even years, probably a year to be accurate. But basically want to show a little bit about like what is prompt engineering and like how does it help us. So like going back to this picture, it's like we're not really changing the model. We still have this kind of like generic low relevance entire internet training model. And the hypothesis with prompt engineering is that we can go from this kind of high variance of relevance to a more kind of medium relevance on the like t-shirt sizing scale of goodness. The way that we're going to do that is just by making increasingly relevant prompts. So the kind of the first way that we're going to start doing this is just by like structuring our prompts in new ways and using this thing that Hugo mentioned earlier called system messaging to talk to the open API system. Cool. So let's just go back here, go into the prompt engineering lesson, and then I'll hide this guy again. Cool. So in this notebook, it's kind of explaining a little bit the reason for system messages up front. And then we're like actually giving an example of how you can do this in the ChatGPT interface. So what I'm going to do is take this little system message that I've created, which I'll read it to you in a second. And I'm going to go over to ChatGPT and open up the custom instructions, delete all this stuff that I have in here currently. And then under how would you like ChatGPT to respond, I'm going to go ahead and paste this message, which is like a kind of like an intentionally silly thing just to like point out what ChatGPT can do here. And like what the system message is doing to control it. So we're instructing it to write responses like a garden gnome with whimsical and highly informative poems about computer science and business, like so write in a fun way about boring stuff, basically. Make rhymes, be fun and lighthearted, but precise and accurate. Cool. So we've saved the system message. Now we can start a new chat. let's actually just like match with the notebook. Let's go back to GPT 3.5 here. Now for a computer science topic, do you have any suggestions, Hugo? Or should I just go off the cuff?
Um,
What's on
yeah,
these days?
we've
Business
just,
debate.
well, I don't know. We've just been talking about OSS versus vendor APIs. Why don't we ask it about that? I don't know.
Yeah. Describe the motivations for choosing open source or vendor APIs when building machine learning systems. How's that?
Yeah,
Sound good?
great.
Let's see what it does. Okay, so now we see our garden gnome worker going to town with its poem. In the world of code and data so vast, two choices before you to ponder and contrast: open source APIs like a forest so free, or vendor APIs like a cultivated tree. So it's definitely tapping into the Mother Earth part of the system message.
Yeah.
It's got the rhyming, but okay, point is like you can get it to like behave in certain ways. So maybe if you don't like it, that like you don't want to pass on this thing that ChatGPT does to your users, where it's like, I wasn't trained on data since 2021. It's this like pre-canned way that it responds. Like sure, it makes sense for OpenAI to do that at their scale, but maybe that doesn't make sense for your use case. You can use system messages to kind of like get it to like say that thing in a different, more randomized or more general, like human way.
Yeah, and
However,
this is a whimsical example, but let's say like the person you're generating content for was English was their second language, for example. You could say, please use vocabulary and grammar and complexity which is appropriate for people with English as a second language. Or you can describe the level of professionality. You like use language that is appropriate to speak at a shareholder meeting.
Totally. There's so many. Yeah, that's a great example. Or like maybe even something more technical. It's like you can say like only respond in JSON output. Is like these
Absolutely.
models are actually quite good at this kind of thing these days.
Yeah.
And you a lot of times just get away with not even doing fine tuning or anything and just like shoving that into a system message, and it does a reasonable job.
Yeah. Although you need to be careful with stuff like shareholder meetings. Eddie, I think knows this. I've started watching Succession recently, so you definitely don't want the language used
Oh.
in the Succession board meetings, for example.
Oh yeah. What season are you in?
First season, so
Oh man. Oh,
yeah,
okay. Well, it's not even worth talking about at this point.
yeah,
And also we're recording a video. So okay, sometime
to be
we'll go.
continued.
Yeah. Succession meets AI at some point in the future. Okay, cool. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and select my kernel again so I can do my installs in the notebook here without killing my terminal. What we're going to do now is use LangChain, a trendy tool that's got a bunch of different features built into it for like kind of connecting these LLM systems into existing software systems. So what we want to do is basically the same thing that we just saw. So we're going to have a system message. Just clear a little space here. We're going to have a system message and then the human message. Now, the human message is going to be, this is the thing that I am typing into ChatGPT. So this is like us asking it the question about open source versus vendor APIs or something. And then we also have the system message, which this is the thing like you're a garden gnome or only write in JSON or only write like you're Logan Roy or something like this. And in this case, what we want it to do is we're going to just like use ChatGPT to translate language. So we're going to say you are a helpful assistant that translates A to B with many years of experience teaching beginner language students. And then let's see what happens. So we'll go ahead and import some stuff from LangChain. LangChain has excellent documentation, in my opinion, if you want to like read more about this stuff. But what we're importing here is just like a little template that helps us wrap the prompts, and then something that helps us wrap the OpenAI API requests. So it's kind of like LangChain 101, maybe you could describe it as. Have you used LangChain much, Hugo?
Yeah, yeah, I have. So I'm wondering if maybe you could motivate a bit more why we even want to use LangChain here.
Yeah. I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on that. But basically here, I think LangChain is like becoming increasingly common, and like many people are curious about it, and like how does it actually help me compared to say, like why not just format these as Python strings or something like this? Like why do this like extra level of templating kind of where it looks more like a Jinja almost or something like that?
Mm.
My personal answer is I think like as you get more complex and you start chaining these things together, like as the name suggests, that becomes harder and harder to manage and harder to trace in between like the hops of all the different ways that your prompts are changing. And those kind of like this like Russian nesting dolls situation happening of like prompts within prompts. So I think that's one thing is like to have a nice framework for organizing these is like the first thing I started using. But now increasingly they have a whole bunch of other stuff that's like very interesting in terms of interacting with LLMs that I'm curious about. But it's kind of beyond the scope of this. Like the short answer for this session is that I think these APIs are just very clean and a little bit easier, a little bit less boilerplate than working with the APIs directly.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good way to manage complicatedness and or complexity. I think it does introduce certain amounts of complication itself, and that may be necessary, but still early days. But it does help us in these cases for sure.
Totally. Cool. Now, once we have our little API, what we can do is we can call chat, and then we're going to format our messages. So I've just wrapped a little function around here. So we're basically making our own little Google translator in 3 lines of Python code. So I'm going to go ahead and just define this function in my terminal. All right, cool. So we've got a little translate function. Now, let's go ahead and we'll type from English to any suggestion on language, Hugo? Like I can't put Australian. That's not even sensical.
I mean,
maybe should we try French?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it'd do something like Mandarin or something like that, which has a totally different alphabet and way of structuring words.
Yeah, I definitely got ChatGPT to write in Japanese. I can't read anything in Mandarin, so it's a bit hard to say now. But
why don't you do Japanese then, if you can read Japanese?
Yeah, I can read a little bit of Japanese. Okay, so let's. I'll just keep the same message to keep it interesting, to keep it straightforward. Yeah, so we see. Okay, so we said I love programming, and we want to go from English to Japanese, and we see watashi wa programming ga daisuki desu. So it's like, as far as I know, that's how you say that in Japanese. Pretty direct. Now, what's kind of cool is we can also do stuff like this now. So you can say translate from Japanese to Spanish. And this is kind of this is the reason why it's like important, I think, to pay attention to that templating stuff, which LangChain just kind of like forces you to do. Not that you couldn't do it in like raw Python strings or something. But it's like LangChain like kind of gives you like a little head start. Like it gives you like a bit of an API for thinking about this, reasoning about this. So now it kind of translated accurately. I love the programming, maybe a bit different. It's not like the gerund form in Spanish. But let's now finally complete the loop and see if we can go back to English and if it says something reasonable. Oh, I need to get rid of that quote. I'll get off this example after this. So bear with me. I love programming. So it went perfectly back. Full circle now. We've got like a Google Translator clone that's like working reasonably well in 3 lines of Python code. Cool.
Amazing.
End of this notebook, there's a bunch of research papers here that have been linked. Essentially, there's a lot of different research dimensions branching off of this like basic prompt engineering idea. Like how do you, like without changing the model, how do you get these things to behave in a more useful way to help you complete goals or do something? I'll kind of leave it at that, and people can explore these papers and like add their own stuff, and like please suggest in Slack if you have other things that you've read that are interesting you'd like to see in notebooks like this in the future. But Hugo, I'm curious if are there any like things that you see in this chart or any kind of like angles on research around like all this chain of thought, prompt engineering stuff of late?
I think there's so much to say here. It's not. I think we should leave it like this in order to move on with other aspects of the tutorial, but people can jump in here. I actually, one thing I'm particularly interested in, but we should say this for another time, is like zero shot prompts and ranking and that type of stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff in here, but let's leave it for the time being.